Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallett, and thanks for being with us today. So today we're going to get into the topic of budget reconciliation. What on earth does that mean? Well, if you've been following along with the upcoming Trump administration and the legislative activity, you may have heard that they are likely to pass most of their initiatives within legislation called budget reconciliation. Well, what exactly is that? What's the history behind that process? How does it work? We're going to unpack all of that on today's show with our staff writer, Annalise Reimold. Annalise, great to have you back today.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. 2 weeks in a row. Happy to be here.
Did you get to bring your little guy out in the snow this week?
I did. He didn't like it. It was a little too cold for him, but my dog loved it, so that's great.
Disappointing, right?
Yeah, true.
You do live down south, so yeah. Yeah, the Southerners, we're not used to snow. This is our first snowfall in Charleston since 2018.
Oh, wow.
So that's pretty fun. Pretty neat to see it all play out and kids get to run around.
Yeah, that's really
So
fun.
you make the best of whatever life hands you, and we got to play in snow.
Yeah. I sent a lot of Slack messages that had random numbers added to them because he was sitting on my lap during most of the day.
Yeah,
Pretty good.
babies and cats, right? Those are pretty much the sort of
True.
worst offenders on that front. So
Yes.
well, we're all warm in our homes, which is great. So now we can dig in.
Yeah.
So just give us a kind of quick overview. What is budget reconciliation?
It's a pretty complex topic. So, like you said, I'm going to give a quick overview. Budget reconciliation is a process used in both the House and the Senate, but it's particularly useful in the Senate because it bypasses the usual 60% supermajority vote requirement to get bills to a vote, and it's not subject to the filibuster. So it's much easier to pass than a normal bill. That's a short way of saying that.
Right. Standard legislation, if you want to bring it to the floor, you got to have 60 votes, even though technically you only need 51. But because of the Senate rules, to bypass filibuster, you need 60, which means that if you don't have 60 in your majority,
Exactly.
a lot of times you can't even just bring legislation to the floor all that easily, whereas this gets around that. Is that right?
Exactly. And this one, you only need a simple majority to get it to the floor, so it's a lot easier to pass. It's pretty useful when there's a slim majority that doesn't quite reach that 60 vote mark like you just said. So just like the legislature that we have right now, that's why it's particularly useful. But sorry, to answer your actual question, the House and Senate passed a budget resolution directing committees to create a budget reconciliation bill. And they give specific directives like decrease the revenue or decrease the spending limit, things like that. And the committees create amendments based on the specific directions that they're given from the budget resolution. The committees then send all of their amendments to the budget committees that put them all into one gigantic budget reconciliation bill. And that is when it is sent to debate or sent to be debated.
So would it be fair to say that one way to put it is you take a bunch of different legislative priorities, and instead of having individual standalone legislation, you wrap it all up into one single, typically very large and long bill that covers many, many, many different topics.
Yes.
Is that about right?
Yes, that is correct.
Gotcha. Now, are there rules about how much you can use this process? I mean, for instance, why wouldn't you just use budget reconciliation 15 different times and do 15 smaller bills? Are there rules around how often, how frequently you can use it?
Yeah, so budget reconciliation can only be conducted once per fiscal year. So there is a limit to how many times it can be used. And there are also limits on what can be included in a budget reconciliation bill. You can only include provisions that affect spending, revenues, or the debt limit, and it cannot be used to make any changes to Social Security. And those limitations are enforced through something called the Byrd Rule, which we can get more into later on.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So once fiscal year, right? So therefore, the incentive for a legislative entity becomes, let's cram everything we possibly can into this because we've only got one shot at it.
Yes.
So maybe let's just back up a little bit. What's kind of the history behind this? Has this been a tool that's been around since Congress was first formed, or is this something fairly recent? When we had you on the show recently, we talked about the Congressional Review Act, CRA, which is a recent development. as a congressional tool. It was first implemented and created under the Clinton administration.
Yes.
What about budget reconciliation? Is this a new phenomenon as a congressional legislative tool, or has it been around a long time?
It is definitely older than the Congressional Review Act. It was signed into law by Richard Nixon in 1974 as part of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. That law created congressional budget committees, the Congressional Budget Office, and the reconciliation process. People believed that the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 gave the president too much power, and this was sort of a response to that. It took away budget authorities from the president and shifted them over to Congress through the budget resolution process. And when it was first created, Congress did 2 budget resolutions every single year and every fiscal year. That's where the term budget reconciliation comes from, because it was sort of a reconciliation of the 2 budget resolutions that were passed each year in Congress. Whenever it was started, it was a lot different than it is now. It wasn't so much used to get around the filibuster, passing policy initiatives. It truly was more budgetary.
Yeah.
Whereas now we see it used more to pass policy initiatives when the majority is slim. And that's where the Bird rule comes around.
Okay, yeah. So tell us, what's the Bird rule? It's not about Larry Bird and NBA free agency. This is a different Bird rule. So what's the Bird rule when it comes to budget reconciliation?
Yeah, so the Bird rule is a provision in the budget reconciliation process that allows senators to challenge and remove amendments from budget reconciliation bills. It is used to challenge individual amendments and provisions, which is useful for a couple of reasons. But the Bird rule really was aimed at making the budget reconciliation process more budget friendly. So things that people can strike from budget reconciliation bills using the Bird rule are things like provisions that have no change in outlays or revenues. Budgetary changes are merely incidental to the non-budgetary or policy components of the amendment, or the committee that was mandated to create an amendment did something outside of their jurisdiction. So it was challenged under the Bird rule, and the amendment was stricken due to that reason. So it just is sort of a way for the minority party to check the power of the majority party so that the majority party can't just pass any policy through the budget reconciliation process. That's essentially why the Bird rule was created.
Right. Now, one of the points I think we should remind our listeners about is that while the Senate and the House are extremely close in their majority control balance today, the House especially, much more than in prior years, the Senate as well, there was a long time period in the early 20th century where the Democratic Party had more than 60 seats for quite a long time. It really wasn't until I think the late 70s, early 80s when the swings became within and under the 60 vote threshold, which is probably intuitively one of the reasons why things moved to expand this budget reconciliation process. Because if you did have more than 60 seats in a chamber, like Democrats did for a long time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, then they could get around the filibuster and pass legislation sort of through your standard legislative process. It's only when a party's majority came below 60 that this seemed to have changed.
Yeah, that is super interesting. I think you're right about that, Jeff.
Is there a point in the process where, folks who study budget reconciliation would say this is the turning point when this kind of legislative policy-making act began to run and funnel through this bill process?
Yeah, I think that you're right about what you said about the majorities becoming slimmer towards the late 70s. And whenever we see the emergence of the Bird rule, which is in the 1980s, I think that's when things started to really change and people started to use budget reconciliation less as a fiscal tool and more as a policy initiative tool.
Gotcha.
I don't think that there was one specific bill that people pointed to and were like, this is when things changed. But I think that senators just started to challenge more amendments. And specifically, the Bird rule is named after a senator who was big on challenging amendments because they were unrelated to budgetary ends and means.
One of the things to really make sure we sort of highlight here and unpack a little bit is for a lot of political listeners, they might be wondering, well, what is this? I've never heard of budget reconciliation before. And the history that you're unpacking is that this has been used quite a bit and pretty frequently, especially since the 1980s, on a very, very regular basis. So it's not a new vehicle for Congress to be using. what are some of the other historical examples of budget reconciliation that really stand out that, political listeners might say, "Oh, I know that bill. I didn't realize that was budget
Right.
reconciliation also. I just knew that bill by its name or, a part of it." So, what are some of the more prominent historical examples?
Yeah, I mean, even recently, so Biden signed two into law. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 are both budget reconciliation bills. Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2018, which is a reconciliation bill. And then Obama vetoed one in 2015 and signed another in 2010. So, like you said, it's pretty common, very regularly used. Even with the Inflation Reduction Act from Joe Biden, we can look at the numbers in the Senate. We had 48 Democrats with two independents caucusing with them, and Republicans had 50. So there was no majority. And the reconciliation process was essentially the only way that any policy initiatives were going to get passed. So, I mean, the provisions included investment into energy and climate change infrastructure, an extension of the Affordable Care Act, allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, corporate taxes, enhancing tax enforcement. So, quite a lot of policy related initiatives. And of course, they do have to do with the budget because you can't entirely divorce policy initiatives from budget initiatives and things like that. But we saw the simple majority used in the Senate to bypass the filibuster, and it passed on a margin, the whole bill passed on a margin of 51-50, with then Vice
Right.
President Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote in favor of passage.
Okay.
So we can really see how budget reconciliation was important in getting this signed into law.
Yeah, I'd imagine most people do remember those bills and, perhaps they never realize that those also went through the budget reconciliation process. What about, let's just briefly unpack the veto in 2015. So when that bill was vetoed, what then happens to it? Because sometimes when a bill is vetoed, you can try to override, you can make some changes to the bill and bring it back again. But of course, if there's only one opportunity, does that mean that, kind of one shot and you're done? Or, tell us a little what happened in 2015 after Barack Obama vetoed that bill.
So, yeah, Obama vetoed the Restoring Americans Healthcare Freedom Reconciliation Act of 2015 because it was passed through by a Republican controlled Congress, and he vetoed it, and it failed to override the president's veto. To override the president's veto, you need a 2/3 majority, and the House did not get that.
Got it. Okay, so let's unpack what I think is, in my opinion, one of the most complicated parts of this, which is there are things that you can do via budget reconciliation, and then there are things you can't. And there's an arbiter who makes that determination of what you can and can't include, and that's all very complicated and takes a long time. I think maybe to sort of set up this, sort of multifaceted answer here, these bills don't materialize overnight, right? They take quite a long time to sort of put together and materialize and bring to a vote. There's a lengthy
Right.
process. Can you give us a kind of a estimation of how long does this typically take when budget reconciliation is pursued?
Well, so we get the budget resolution that has reconciliation directives. So it goes to all the separate committees that receive directives, and they're drafting up their amendments. And then after that, it goes to the budget committee, like I said earlier. And then after that, it's debated. It just depends on legislators and how much they want to push it through. I mean, we've already seen Mike Johnson saying that he wants to have a reconciliation bill on Trump's desk by the end of April. That doesn't seem like very long, but it is quite an arduous process, especially if we take into consideration how the bird rule plays in here. And like you said, there's a lot of very complex voting and provision situations that go into this.
Got it. Got it. Right. So yeah, it takes a few months. So then the bird rule challenges a sort of neutral arbiter who's deciding what can and can't happen. How does that work? So when someone challenges something, who decides what can be in this bill? Who decides if something gets thrown out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is very complicated. There's a list of reasons.
It's the theme of this stuff. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's true. So there is a list of things that can be disqualified from reconciliation bills. And the main theme is that they are less to do with budget than they are to do with policy. But the way the Byrd rule works in practice, so I'll just start with the arbiter that you were mentioning. So there's two people that play a role in this. It's the Senate parliamentarian, who is an advisor to the Senate, and they advise committees and the presiding officer on the rules of the Senate. And then the other person is the presiding officer who makes decisions. So while committees are drafting up their reconciliation bills, the Senate parliamentarian can advise them on amendments that will not be acceptable for the budget reconciliation process for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Like they're just, for example, they affect no change in outlays or revenues, or the budgetary changes are merely incidental to non-budgetary components, things like that. So the parliamentarian can tell them while they're drafting up the bill, that's not going to fly. So you should not include that. And that is essentially a use of the Byrd rule. Once the budget reconciliation bill with all of the different amendments from the committees reaches the floor, senators can raise a point of order against an amendment in the bill. And that means that they're challenging the amendment and want to get it stricken from the bill under the Byrd rule. So people who are in favor of the amendment can vote to protect the amendment from the Byrd rule. But in order to do that, they need 60 votes to protect the amendment from the Byrd rule. If they fail to protect the amendment from the Byrd rule, then the presiding officer can decide to strike the amendment from the reconciliation bill. So the Senate parliamentarian is advising the presiding officer on whether the amendments that are challenged are extraneous or not, and whether they should be removed. And so the presiding officer makes the final decision, but the Senate parliamentarian, who has special knowledge of Senate rules and how the reconciliation process is working, is here advising the presiding officer. We don't really see the presiding officer going against the Senate parliamentarian's advice, though we have a couple times. And it's been many years. It's been since 1975. But
Let's pick an example if you can, and maybe unpack this a little bit more. So let's pick one where there was a amendment brought forward and it was protected and then did receive 60 plus votes and stayed. And then we'll do an example where an amendment was not protected and the parliamentarian did strike it. So if you have a couple examples, let's try and unpack a little bit so we can concretely try to understand this very complicated legislative process here. So let's start with the first one. A protected amendment got a vote, got enough support, and was kept because it was protected. What do you got?
Ballotpedia has not tracked any cases in which an amendment has been protected after it was challenged under the Byrd rule. So going back to the Inflation Reduction Act, there was an amendment in the reconciliation bill that established a procedure for terminating a determination by the Surgeon General to suspend certain entries and exports from building in places. So it's very in the weeds, but it was in the reconciliation bill. And someone challenged that amendment. In order to protect the amendment and keep it in the reconciliation bill, it needed 60 votes, and it only got 56. So this really shows us why the reconciliation process as a whole is really helpful when you don't have a 60-vote majority. So Democrats could not protect this amendment because they did not have the 60 votes to protect it in the reconciliation bill. Which means if they tried to pass it not with the budget reconciliation process, it also probably wouldn't pass because it needed a 60-vote requirement there. All that to say, it was struck from the bill. The presiding officer sustained the points of order and took it out of the bill. There were other amendments that were struck from the bill. There were in total 8 amendments struck from the bill. 4 of them were struck before they reached the floor for debate, and 4 were struck during the debate time in the Senate. And one thing that I totally forgot to mention earlier is that we're talking mainly about the Senate here because the House doesn't have this supermajority requirement or the filibuster or anything like that. And so the Byrd rule is specific to the Senate, but the House still does pass budget reconciliation bills. They just don't have the Byrd rule process because it has different House rules. So I just want to avoid any confusion about that. It is a 2-house process, but this is the Byrd rule is specific to the Senate.
Okay, so yeah, this is going to be a really interesting process to follow along with, and seems to have kind of become a regularly occurring theme within congressional sessions now. How can listeners follow along with Ballotpedia's coverage of budget reconciliation if they wanted to find out more?
So Ballotpedia has worked really hard to conglomerate a lot of information about budget reconciliation on a portal page called the Budget Reconciliation in US Congress. And we have a lot of information there, including uses of budget reconciliation in the 2025 Congress. We'll also probably be keeping readers up to date in our Brew newsletter. So I encourage people to follow along that way. It's a free newsletter.
Lots of different ways for readers and listeners to stay up to date with all of the activities in Congress with budget reconciliation, whether here in our podcast or in our newsletters or on our webpages at ballotpedia.org. So, Annalise, thanks for all of your work researching this very complicated subject, and always great to have you on the show.
Yeah, it was really great talking about it. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for boiling down so simply. For our listeners, you can learn more about reconciliation at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pellett, and thanks for listening.